Almost 74% of all online shoppers are going to abandon their cart. And if you don't have a way set up to re-engage these lost prospects, you probably are losing out on millions of dollars of revenue for your brand. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to recover these customers through an abandoned cart sequence set up inside of Klaviyo. But these strategies aren't based on theory. These are things that we're doing day in and day out over at Cracked Retention. And these are the same concepts that we're applying that really are set up to bring in and recover these lost prospects and turn them into net new revenue for brands like DNA Genetics, who recently just launched their e-commerce brand, and they're pulling 19% of their overall revenue through abandoned cart recovery alone, which is huge. So if you want to do the same, I'm going to show you the exact steps and workflows that are going to be needed to do that. Let's get right into Klaviyo. The first thing you'll need to do is find the correct flow within Klaviyo. And honestly, they make this way harder than they should be. And it comes down to really just naming convention. The reason being is that many people, when they think of an abandoned cart sequence, they're actually referring to an abandoned checkout sequence. And this comes down to essentially email consent. What it comes down to is that the checkout started event, which is the one that the abandoned checkout sequence, which is the one we're going to be building out, that event actually collects the email consent because it's during checkout, which also is a very, very high intent portion of the funnel. And this is the one we're going to be focused on. It's also the one that collects things like your first name and all that personalization info. So this is the one we're going to crux in on and really just zero in on. Your add to cart, recovery piece, it can be good and typically is more like beneficial for bigger brands, but typically that relies on you having collected consent beforehand, typically through a pop-up, it being a repeat customer, whatever it might be. But in the case of most brands, you're going to see a lot of revenue specifically come from abandoned checkout sequences. So that's what we're going to focus on here today. All right, so now that we're in Klaviyo, what we're going to want to do is we're going to go over here to flows on the left-hand side. We're going to click create a flow, and then we're going to search for abandoned. And what we're going to look for is the abandoned cart reminder. So I know it says abandoned cart, but we're really after that abandoned checkout. But if you click on here, you're going to see that it says when someone checkout started. So that's the same event that we're after. That's why the naming convention as far as the confusion comes around it, but we're going to call it abandoned checkout sample. I'm going to click use template. Now, once we get in here, and for the sake of this, I'm actually not going to be covering SMS in this specific video. That's an entirely different topic. Like, it's a huge thing that we can touch on, but in this case, I'm going to focus on just email. So what we're going to want to do actually really quick is I'm going to clean up the SMS, right? So we're going to just remove these. And now we only have our emails. So that's all set and dandy, making sure we have our correct trigger set up here. This looks good, checkout started and not add to cart. So now that we're looking at that, quick thing that we want to make sure is that we want to make sure that there is no smart sending set up here. In the case of that, how you check that is you click on the email and scroll all the way down. There's also an icon here that would pop up, but we want to make sure that this isn't checked because this is going to essentially kill a bunch of your sending volume. So we're not worried about that unless you have some special need for that. But what we're going to want to do is just enable UTM parameter tracking. This is always just a best practice if you're doing any kind of Google Analytics tracking. All right, so that is step one. All right, so now on to step two. And step two is going to be essentially, hey, let's make sure that we configure all of our critical flow filters. And what are filters? Filters are essentially inside of your flow ways to make sure that certain people are either getting kicked out of said sequence to make sure that, or they don't really even enter said sequence because they don't meet certain criteria. In the case of a checkout started, an abandoned checkout sample in this case, we're not going to be doing any trigger filters because this is going to be a very general series. So we're not going to be looking at trigger filters too much. But as far as profile filters, what we want to make sure is that people aren't getting, for example, this after they've already purchased, or that they aren't getting this continuously because they're checking out many, many times in a certain few days. We don't want it to be bombarding. So what I like to do in here is in our profile filters, make sure it's set that placed order 0 times since starting the flow is set up, and then use an and also make sure it has not been in this flow, or they've not been in this flow in the last 7, 14, 30, whatever you decide, whatever your heart desires, that's a good way to do it. So make sure that that's set up. And if you want to even go a further step, there are other different profile filters you can set up. Things like, setting it up such that we're excluding any spam email addresses. Specifically, if we wanted to set it up such that, let's see, go into here, let's do what someone has done. Make sure that they haven't bounced 0 times since starting the flow. In this case, I always like to specify specifically that it's a soft bounce. You could even set that up. And then you could, even if you wanted to, you could set up some purchase history segmentation, but that's getting a little bit more advanced. And like we talked about before, this is going to be a very general catch-all sequence. I'm going to leave it like this. Keep that bounced email piece there just because it keeps deliverability a little bit stronger. But that right there is how you're going to set up your filters. And if you run an e-commerce brand and this technical stuff and all this jargon is just too much and you just really want to hand it off to a team of experts, really just book a call in the first link in the description. We'll chat it through. We'll do an audit. We'll see what flows you actually need and what needs to be worked on and take it from there. We worked with, for example, Shutterbombs in the past, and we tripled their email revenue in just 2 months just by looking at their flows, and it's been just a huge thing. So if you want the same results for your brand, let's have a discussion, figure out what makes sense and what you need to be doing, and we can go from there. But with that being said, let's get back to the video. All right, so step 3, setting up your dynamic email elements. What we're gonna be really doing here is just personalizing the email, making sure that it's a true abandoned cart email. So let's get right into it. We're gonna click on our first email, we're gonna hit edit, and we're gonna dive right in. If we get into here, this is your default setup. You know, you're obviously gonna wanna customize it to your brand, but in the case of just the key elements that you're gonna wanna be able to take advantage of here, if you wanted to add in something that's talking to them about their like first name and whatnot, go ahead and like this, hit personalization, put in their first name there. You can even put in a backfill or a thing right here. So let's say friend, and this is what's going to populate if we don't actually have that. I always like to use our certain case right here, and we're going to get that in there. So whenever somebody does go in, and like in the case of myself here, if I got this email, it would say, hey, Aaron, your cart is saved, but those items won't last forever. Come back and complete your order today. Then I'm going to get that button and whatnot, and it's going to look great. So that's the first name portion. The big things that we're after here, and the reason that we use the actual template here, and this is a key portion of it, is this specific thing right here, because without it, you have a very, very difficult time setting this up. So this does it for you in a very, very simple and easy way. What I'd want to go ahead and do is, if you're going to use this for your brand, is you're going to make sure it's branded to yourself. You're going to go in here, you're going to change up the fonts. Like in this case, hey, maybe I'm not using Poppins as like or maybe I am using Poppins as my thing. So I'm going to change out all these different things here, potentially switch it to normal, switch this to potentially a bold, keep it like that, make it a little bit more on brand and whatnot. That's going to really kind of up level the email design a little bit more, make it look like your brand. It's going to look a lot better. In the case of this is a really, really good start. You can get into some more advanced stuff, and I may just have to create a separate video on this. But for example, like some brands, you may run things like shipping protection. You don't really want those popping up as an item inside of someone's cart, because realistically it's actually just an add-on. So you can actually set up some filters to actually get rid of that, but I'll walk that through in a different video. We'll go over that because that is a critical thing that could be kind of pertinent to your brand. So as far as the table here, what I would always recommend doing is saving it as a universal content block, just to make sure that you don't lose it. So I always call it the abandoned checkout block. And then usually like view one if I want to adjust it in the future. But I'll save it as that, and that's really the block that I'm going to be needing for every single one of my future emails if I really want to focus on and show that cart content. Now in this case, because this is a test account, I actually can't show it, but if you did have an email, I'll have to potentially put up a preview one, but you're gonna have your image on the left-hand side, you're gonna have some details about that product with the name, quantity, and total and whatnot. Very, very straightforward and standard. Get right into it. That's the first email there. All right, so now let's move on to step 4, which is actually building the email strategy. And one thing that we don't want to fall into is the pitfall that many brands do, which is just falling into really just more of a cookie cutter approach, which is typically like just a follow-up, followed by another follow-up, followed by just maybe, hey, here's a discount. Whatever it might be. There are definitely better ways to go about it, and many of it comes down to just crafting the customer journey and understanding where the friction points. It may come down to specific objections that are unique to your brand, be it pricing, being it lack of social proof, whatever they might be looking for. Now I'm going to give you in this just a simple 4-step approach that you can take to it, but really you have to figure out what resonates with your brand, what messaging, what kind of things that you have to address. And then from there, you're going to go from a meh kind of abandoned checkout sequence to something that's really stellar and performs really, really well. It just comes down to understanding your customer, figuring out what's going to get them across the line, and then addressing it in the moment. So with that said, let's get back into Klaviyo. Let's go through that 4-step sequence that I might recommend that you can use as a framework and how you can go about it from there. All right, so getting right into it, email 1 comes to no surprise. Quick reminders are very, very effective. They're very, very important. There's no need to do anything special really in that first email, because many times it actually is potentially something where the customer just had to step away for a second, but we just want to give them that touch point to actually just bring them right back. So in the case of this, what we're looking for is something that's very, very simple. direct subject line. In this case, like I like to say something like, did you mean to do that? You were just a click away. Something like that's going to drive some action from them, get them back into it. We're going to show them those abandoned checkouts, items that we had inside of that block that we looked at before. We're going to go from that to a clear call to action. And then we're not going to really show any discounts whatsoever at this point. No point in giving up any of that juicy margin. Let's focus on actually speaking to the customer versus trying to get them straight, price discounts. No need to train them on that yet. So let's get right there. One thing that I do recommend testing though is how quickly this first email does come in. This first email can range from a 30-minute all the way to a 4-hour. Really does range. So if you want to set up a simple test, now it does come down to realistically how many people you have flowing through it, but let's say you have 1,000 people going through your checkout sequence a month, you could probably do a lot more testing. But if you're something a little bit smaller, maybe you want to keep it to only 2 branches. So in this case, if I wanted to create a 2-branch sequence, all I would do is add a conditional split, click on a random sample, 50%. I'm going to add a time delay, put it for 4 hours as something just a little bit more, give some more separation between these. And then we're going to duplicate this first email, drag it over here, just delete this and clean up the naming. And that's really all it is. And then from there, we just drag and drop it to make sure that it connects back to the sequence. So if you wanted to run that, you could do that. If you wanted to add even more, you could add more by doing an even more bigger split here. So if I wanted to, for example, do a 4-hour and a 2-hour, I'd add another conditional split here, 50-50, go between 4 hours and 2 hours, and add potentially another one here between 30 minutes and an hour. And that's how you can very quickly run a 25, 25, 25, 25 across 4 different emails. Well, not different emails, same email, but different timing, to get a good look and see how delays affect that. Now, obviously you want to make sure that every kind of test that you do is statistically significant. That's huge. We don't want to make any assumptions based off of potentially an outlier, but this is a good start. So as far as that, make sure that you're, setting up that quick reminder, testing that first delay, and that's a good start. Next thing that we want to do, wait a day, and then we want to move into some social proof and benefits. In this case, subject line, I like to, in this case, just put as a placeholder here, but join the 50,000 plus other happy customers using XXX, just a placeholder. And in this email, what we're going to want to do is really focus on the trust building with the specific prospect here. We're also going to potentially focus on things like customer reviews, making sure we're including at least 3 of them, give them some breadth, give them some showing of like, hey, there's more than just one person enjoying this thing. Go over some product benefits. This is the point when we really need to be speaking to it, because they're right at the edge of converting. So, this might be a little bit more difficult in bigger SKU stores, but if like this is in a 1 SKU store, this is the time to shine. This is when you can really nail down those benefits, show them to the customer, say, hey, you're going to miss out on this. So that's a big thing to focus on there. Address any of those common selling objections, any USPs that you have. And then if you have any of those social proof icons, be it like any magazine features, any news articles, that kind of stuff also helps here, and it adds a lot more social proof. So that's what we see really kind of happening inside of email 2 with social proof and benefits. Big thing there. And then finally moving on next, after we're going to wait another day, we're going to do some objection handling. And this is really where we're going to start to address those deeper brand specific objections. In the case of like, for example, let's say a frozen seafood client that we're working with is trying to address like freshness concerns. So maybe they're going to say something along the lines of, hey, this is the technology we use to make sure that the food arrives to you fresh and ready to go, so you don't have to have any worries about receiving some honestly like rotten food, right? We don't want to have that. We want to make sure that the customer is feeling safe about it, making sure that they have that piece of information that they may need to unlock that confidence to then go and purchase. And in that example, they may go and say, hey, all right, fine, you addressed my objection about what I was trying to potentially avoid, and they're going to go in and purchase. So this is where you can get more specific to your product. This is why understanding your customer and your product is the best thing to do, because crafting this email is very, very important in having that information. So doing that, including potentially some scarcity portions, and then also looking at even adding some UGC. Like we said before, even though we're using social proof in the second, doesn't mean we can't use it in the third. So very, very good portion and thing that we should include inside of email 3. Once we're done with email 3, we're going to move on to the 4th. This is where you're typically going to see some things like pricing objections. You could move this up higher in the thing, but I myself like to keep this as like a last resort. So in this case, here's 20% on us. That could be beefed up more as a subject line, but for the sake of this, we're really focusing on the fact that this last one is going to be really, really focused on price. Hey, in this case, you can potentially do it 10%, 15, 20, whatever it might be, whatever your offer is, this is the time to put it in. this is the time to potentially get the customer interested. And then from here, we're just going to push, hey, there's discount offers here. And this is really only going to go for non-purchasers. So really what you want to make sure you do here is you got a conditional split. And then what you're going to want to do is make sure that you go over here. What has someone done? You're going to say placed order, and you're going to put 0 times over all time. And you're going to move these over to the yes, because I want to make sure they are on the side. That's that. And that's going to make it so that the people on the left-hand side are the people who've never purchased before, and they're going to serve that offer because we don't need repeat customers coming back and getting another 20%. All right, so I know that we did just cover the first 4 basic emails. If you wanted to extend it, you could even go farther and farther depending on how your performance is going. And typically the benchmark that we look for whenever we're doing kind of extensions side of abandoned checkout sequences is that we're seeing at least a place order rate of 1% on the last email. If we're seeing that, that means, hey, there's potentially still some more interest, and we're in a spot where we're potentially losing revenue. So from there, I might say, hey, let's add some more emails to the end. And what might those look like? Well, let's look at it this way. So in the 4th one, we did some pricing objections. There's a lot more that can be done, but if we wanted to potentially add more and deeper, pricing objection ones, we could even add like a 2 to 3 day delay past here and add an even deeper discount. Discount ladders are a concept I refer to, which is, hey, we're going to try a discount, and then a few days later, we're going to try a different discount, and then a few days later, we're going to try a different discount. And essentially what it's going to do is it's going to find what the best offer is that can convert the customer at that point. So not only are we adding more touch points, but we're also testing, hey, where's the sweet spot in terms of offer? So you could do that as a potential test, but you can also extend the sequence that way. You could also do things like if you are, for example, a brand that does focus on, either like a product offering of like something like a free trial. This is where you can offer that as well, depending on what your margins can call for. You may also ask, for example, if you wanted to do a plain text email, have it come from a founder via plain text and say, hey, what kind of feedback? What's the issue here? This also works very well on high volume emails because yes, you're not going to typically get too many responses from it. But if you do get responses, they're going to be valuable to kind of framing and kind of shaping that. So what I would recommend doing is that if you do that, do it as a plain text email, have it come from the founder. With that said, you can take these pieces. This is really the time to shine when it comes to collecting as much as you can and kind of trying to convince this, because this really is the highest intent portion of your funnel. So the more ideas you can generate as to things that you can either, get feedback, address an objection, the better. It really does come down though to how you're going to cater it to your brand. All right, so talking step 6, which is just more advanced strategies. These are things that you can take into account. I'm just going to talk through them for you, just make it very, very simple. But essentially what you can get from here is you can get into things like breaking down by high versus low value cards. For example, if you have a very, very high ticket level of items and you want to treat those customers differently, then you can do so. If those people are more price sensitive, then address them with potentially more price objections. If the low value people and low value carts typically just need more content to kind of push them to really understanding the product, maybe you need more of a content-based approach on those. Really taking your abandoned checkout sequence and kind of looking at it from the lens of how do I treat each piece of these customers differently to what they need to get over the line, that's the way to do it. Even breaking it down by product. We have many, many brands that we work with that are more than just like one specific product, which is typically easier to deal with. But if they're multiple, maybe breaking it down by things like big categories like men's, women's, kids, that's another thing you can do. You can also break it down by product category, whatever it might be. Whatever you can use to kind of cater the content towards that specific thing, it's going to convert better. So always trying to figure out, and in the case of this, also make sure that you have enough volume for it and to actually push for it. But if you do have the volume for it and you are going to potentially see some gains from it, like a 1 to 2% increase in conversion rate, then always go for that more targeted approach, because it is going to convert better because you're speaking and converting that messaging directly toward what they're looking for. This is where things like zero-party data can really draw and create huge, immense results when it comes to flows. Because if you have something like, hey, this is like the product benefit and the product health benefit that I'm after, and you can cater an entire flow kind of path towards that specific thing, you're speaking very directly to that customer and their pain point, and you have a much better, not even chance, but you have a much, much better level of, connection with that customer, and then making them much more likely to convert. And then finally, step 7, which is just going to be your general A/B testing strategy. The 4 big things that you're going to want to test are your subject lines, your email content, your send times, and then also your discount strategy. So between those 4 things, Make sure you're testing the different angles with your subject lines. Same thing when it comes to your objections within the email content itself. Discount ladders, start low, then build your way up. And then also send times like we did on that first email. These are all going to be very, very valuable things that you can be testing within your flow to kind of take you to the next level. And then make sure you stick to a few testing best practices. Always make sure that you're not testing too many variables all at the same time, because if you are testing a bunch of variables, there's a very good chance that you actually can't tell which one is leading to the actual increase in performance. Leading into the second piece of that, make sure that you're making sure that everything that you test has statistical significance. And what I mean by that is that you could have an outlier, you could have too small of a sample size, whatever it might be, but you actually, if you don't go through that portion of it, you're never going to know if what you're doing is actually improving performance, because it could be just, hey, it could just be an outlier and you're going down the wrong path. When you're doing any kind of objection testing, make sure you're not changing any of the variables like we were saying when I just started, but don't change that many variables. Don't change your subject line. Test just the angle of the content. See if this specific angle is better than the other. Social proof versus pricing versus, even within that, like test different pieces of social proof. What I always advise my team is to just send the test, read the data, and then from there, let the data do the talking. Figure out from there what makes sense and push it from there. Always make sure, as a fourth piece when it comes to practicing any kind of testing here, is that you are prioritizing testing within the abandoned checkout sequence, because more than likely it's going to be the number 1 or number 2 best performing sequence inside of your account. With that said, these are the best practices that you need to implement when it comes to A/B testing within your abandoned checkout sequence, and I hope you go through and do them. Now, that's really going to be everything that you're really going to need to set up a high converting abandoned cart flow in 2025, but realistically speaking, that's only one of the 6 or 7 flows that you're going to need to have a high performing email ecosystem. So that kind of leaves you 2 options. You can either take this knowledge and kind of try and apply it for yourself, go through a bit of trial and error, or you can pull in on a team of experts like myself, and we can kind of put this together for you. We've worked with huge brands, for example, like Fly by Jing, built out all of their flows, and we can do the same for your brand. So if this is something that you're interested in, click the link in the first thing inside of my description here, and we'll have a chat and go through that. We'll audit your account, take a look at your flows, and tell you what you need. With that said, I hope to see you in the next video, but if you have any questions, please leave them down below. All right, see ya.